Setting: New England, Australia. Mindset: apprehensive but open-minded. Had previous high-dose LSD experiences twice in the month prior to trip that had been very thought-provoking and strange. It was Christmas Eve and my partner and I had decided to spend it away from our families and closer to nature. We had traveled out of town to our favorite spot. It was a hot summer day, but you could feel in the air that in the afternoon we would have a thunderstorm. The area we were in was beautiful. It was mostly open pastures nestled between the mountains. There were very few people around. Creeks, rivers and brooks sweep the valley floor, and we spent most of the morning exploring indigenous sites in the surrounding valley. We had lunch at the local pub and a few beers before dropping the acid in the early afternoon. These were by far the strongest tabs I have ever had, and I cannot even guess what the dose was. But one tab was enough to catapult me toward another reality. Prior to tripping, I had some reservations about the coming weather. The clouds were looming large and thunder was echoing in the distance. However, common sense was outweighed by a desire to dive deeper into hyperspace. Previous experiences with this batch of tabs had yielded vivid, Aztec-like sacred geometries that I have since experienced simply using cannabis. Maybe some HPPD? Either way, it's quite pleasant. As we dosed up and rolled out the picnic blanket, we sat watching some cattle graze in an adjacent field. I checked my phone and sure enough, the icons begun to morph and dance on the screen. This is it, I thought. As the trip really started to accelerate, I had a feeling that I was heading into an alien unknown. It was at this point the storm begun. A light rain fell and for the most part it was pleasant, but as the acid kept increasing in intensity, the rain became more of a menace. Eventually the rain picked up and we, having no shelter besides a small tent, decided to sit in the car and wait it out. Hardly an ideal place to trip. We sat in the car and watched the cattle unfazed by the storm. I had hoped that the storm would pass and we would be able to sit outside, as the damp air and hot weather had made the car somewhat of a sauna. However, the rain increased in intensity. I sat there thinking, here they come, feeling as though a presence was breaking through reality to try and make contact. My visuals were at first closed-eyed only. Small black squares had started to appear and spin rapidly, forming complex geometric patterns. They seemed to invite me to follow them and I refused, instead focusing on other things and steer the close-eyed visuals. Failing to shake the black squares, I opened my eyes and stared at the rain falling on the windshield. The rain slowly became overtaken by the pattern, a common experience we had both had staring at our bathroom wall while stripping. The pattern, a cobweb-like image that becomes apparent particularly on textured surfaces on moderate LSD doses. It appears to spread centrally from the visual field in a T-like configuration. Prolonged focusing on the pattern tends to increase its intensity and slowly it spreads to fill the visual field entirely and interact with the surrounding environment. The pattern for me is associated with information being transferred. So at this point I was seeing the pattern, then those little black squares became apparent in the raindrops and they began to align along the vertices of the pattern. At this point my partner was enjoying watching the cows whilst I was fighting back a complete breakdown of my reality. I knew the experience was becoming too intense for me to resist, so I just decided to go with it. After a while I felt the intensity drop slightly and I became more comfortable with the headspace I was in. The pattern persisted, but the pulling sensation from the squares had stopped. In fact, they seemed to have retreated. By now the body high was intense. I felt hot, thirsty, and my whole body felt like it was glowing. As we had been tripping for about an hour or two now, we had decided to smoke a J at what we estimated was the peak of the experience. Previous experiments with J's and acid have resulted in an electrified feeling with synesthesia, color splitting, and increased 3D open-eyed visuals. We were keen to replicate these effects and observe them in further detail. The rain was still pouring, but the car was becoming uncomfortable, so we suited up in the most rainproof clothing we had. None of which, bar one raincoat, was actually weatherproof. However, we had hit our tripping stride and took it all as part of the fun. We set out with J in hand to smoke by the river and enjoy the light show. Basically, from here on out the rain just continued to increase in intensity. Once we had found a nice tree to stand under, we lit our little dude up and happily blazed it whilst staring into the bushland. This is where it got weird. I started to see the pattern again, so I asked my partner what they were seeing. They described to me that they were seeing the bathroom wall pattern spreading out over everything. I told them I saw the same thing. Then in the center of the pattern an icosahedron/hexagon-like shape begun to emerge. It was spinning and covered in Aztec patterns. I described it to them and they reported seeing it too. Fascinated by the shared visual experience, we kept discussing the pattern and the shape we were seeing. At this point I felt as though we had entered some kind of Goosebumps episode. Two kids, sneaking out, smoking weed, seeing an alien object. This thought really stuck in my mind and basically consumed my reality from here on out. As we observed the visual phenomena, I noticed that the shape had begun replicating and had now formed a grid. If you search on icosahedron grid, you'll see some similar depictions of what we saw. My partner also reported seeing this grid emerge. We kept relaying to each other our experiences and what we were observing. The grid appeared to expand infinitely in all directions through the earth and up into the sky. We stood on sections of the grid as we saw it and continued to confirm what we were each observing. As we continued to examine the visual phenomena we were experiencing, we both saw a black square emerge from the center of a section of the grid. I asked my partner what they made of it, and they said it was everything, all religion, all life, all beliefs, all things. I confirmed that was the same impression I was getting. Spooky. At this point I had a flash where I could see a torus with lights ascending and descending it. It was a representation of the cycle of life and death and the infinite nature of existence and consciousness. As the flash passed, the black square became much larger and formed a tunnel. At this point we decided to move on because we were both getting really tripped out and felt like we were being beckoned by the grid. We also realized that we were soaked from the rain and should probably find shelter. As we turned to walk back along the road to the campsite, I observed the grid in the sky, but in the sky between two mountains there was a large icosahedron. It stood out of the grid and took on significance of its own in my mind. On this return walk things became more and more intense. The pooling water on the ground was glowing green, blue and magenta. It appeared that these three colors were being projected off everything around us and were streaming into our bodies. The colors were made up of small packets of hollow squares that spun in response to external sounds. It was at this point I felt that we were being followed by something. I had an unshakable feeling that there was an object floating above us, like that green spinning gem from The Sims or something, and it was trying to communicate. We headed back to the campsite and took shelter under a pagoda. I was now in full trip mode, teetering on the edge of reality. We stood holding each other, trying to look as straight as possible. We both felt as though we were ascending, that we were about to take off and go somewhere else. By now I had completely bought into my alien abduction narrative, piecing together the puzzle that we had found ourselves in. We had gone camping in bad weather conditions, ill-prepared, dressed inappropriately, and had taken psychedelics. I thought to myself, maybe this is it. This is how you exit our reality. This is what happens to those couples that report being abducted. This idea less than impressed my partner, and I had completely shit on their trip and spun them into a negative space. As for me, I was convinced that we were about to be abducted. Behind my head I could feel them. It felt as though sharp surgical instruments were probing my mind. Crunching, grinding sounds filled my skull. I could smell DMT. I felt bubbles traveling up my spine and through the back of my neck. I closed my eyes and the tunnel that I had seen smoking DMT appeared. Peering through was an odd face. The rising tones and high-pitched ringing set in, and I felt that same beckoning feeling again. I resisted. I didn't want to go, even though I really did. I knew that if I went with it I would collapse. I was already freezing cold and soaking wet. There were other campers around and I'd draw too much attention if I just collapsed. Besides, the only explanation I'd be able to offer for my present condition would be aliens, and that would surely end with a trip to the emergency department. My partner was now quite concerned and suggested we move elsewhere. We returned to our tent to lie down but found it flooded. To me this was another synchronistic sensation. They wanted us to go with them. My partner, despite how scared they later told me they were, handled this all really well. We ended up back in the car in our underwear, drying ourselves out and trying to survive. In the car continued to have incredible visions of the grid, of eternity, of life, death and rebirth. Eventually, after nearly 8 hours of insanity, I felt able to sleep, so when the rain stopped we went back to the tent and began a long spiral back to Earth. Some of the other sensations experienced through this trip involved complete disassociation with reality, lost time, a very real sense that reality was a projection of the mind, that my partner and I were somehow one and that we shared a reality and a destiny, that everything was an illusion, that we could ascend to become part of the grid. Consciousness is eternal and somehow linked to the grid. Long strange trip.